Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist at American Compass, and today we are talking with Professor Patrick Deneen. Professor Deneen is at Notre Dame and is a prolific writer. He's the author of Why Liberalism Failed, more recently Regime Change, and I was especially excited to talk to him after the First Things 2025 Newhouse lecture that he delivered earlier this year called We Are All Post-Liberals Now. Professor Deneen is one of the great expositors of post-liberalism. I think certainly has a particularly strong critique of what liberalism gets wrong, but it has always been a question, okay, then what does in fact come next? And in his lecture, Deneen, I think, does an excellent job explaining why we are beyond liberalism, but it does leave the question of, well, then what is post-liberalism? And so I was very excited to talk to him about that. We looked at a lot of different flavors of potential post-liberalism out there, especially on the right of center, some of which seem, frankly, quite unpromising, some of which might be very promising. And then also wondered, are we, in fact, on to post-liberalism? Is post-liberalism itself passing us by? So really fun conversation. I think you'll enjoy it a lot. But before we get to that, let me tell you a little bit about Commonplace this week. We've got both ends of the commonplace continuum. From one side, Bradford Tuckfield on how pizza shop owners are fighting market concentration. And from the other, at the very macro level, Mike Lind has a great feature called Don't Let the Fake Social Security Crisis Fool You. Makes the really interesting case that the entire idea that Social Security is going bankrupt is entirely contrived. We could simply say that we pay for Social Security the way we pay for everything else. And if we do that with deficits, we do it with deficits. But there's no reason to say that Social Security is going bankrupt, but the Pentagon is not. That is a purely political choice, and we could choose otherwise. So I think a really interesting way of looking at some of the challenges we have on the fiscal front. Definitely recommend that. Of course, Understanding America, coming to you as always. I haven't hassled you in a bit about The New Conservatives, our fine book of all of American Compass's best thinking and writing from the past 5 years. So if you don't have your copy yet, this is your reminder. Go and pick it up. And with that, here is Professor Deneen. Patrick Deneen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Oren. Nice to see you again.
It is wonderful to see you as well. I always hesitate to intrude on a professor's summer, but I've been eager to talk with you ever since, well, always, but especially since you delivered the First Things Newhouse lecture at New College in Florida on the topic of we are all post-liberals now. And I think the concept of post-liberalism, what it means, where we are headed is what I'm fascinated by. You are really more than anyone, I think, defining it. And so wanted to dive in a little bit on your remarks there. You left the audience hanging a bit on what post-liberalism then would be. But I guess let's start here. What is the liberalism in your mind that you're defining that we are post, if you will?
Sure. Well, typically I'll define that at the very high level of abstraction, quoting figures like John Locke and the founding fathers. But let me bring it down to, since I'm talking to somebody that works in the economic realm, let me bring it down to fairly close to the ground. I think we could look at a couple of areas where liberalism in many ways was thought to sort of reign supreme in recent history. I'll mention four. The first of these, of course, is the idea that borders everywhere are and should fall. That there should be no more arbitrary separations between nations and peoples. And this should, of course, occur both economically, but also in terms of migration, that justice and openness demanded kind of open border worldview. And that I would say that's one of the high watermarks of a liberal worldview, is the argument that all boundaries and borders are fundamentally arbitrary. And of course, then associated with that is of course, an area that you work in quite a bit, the theory that in the economic domain, there should be no or very few limitations on the free exercise of individual choice in the economic domain. So laissez-faire economics. This was not only to leave alone, to leave be, but also the idea that the public order should be largely neutral or disinterested in a way in the decisions that are made in the economic realm allow people to make their choices and allow the sort of wisdom of collective decision making to emerge through a marketplace. And that worldview, I think, is now in some disrepair. The third area I would say was the maybe kind of 90s confident belief in an American-led liberal international world order, or the rules-based order, as it's sometimes called. There's a kind of self-confidence that the liberal beliefs of the American order, two of which I've just mentioned, should become the universal, the globalized political set of commitments. And one figure, of course, we would associate that would be Francis Fukuyama, not only declaring an end of history, but as that cry was took up, the belief that America should, in a sense, be the vanguard of advancing the end of history where there are still outposts of resistance. And the fourth of these is, which I might still seem to be in certain respects operative, but I think is becoming stretched thin, is the kind of the legacy of the sexual revolution of the late 1960s through today. So the decline of sexual norms that restrained or restricted in various ways sexual activity, of course, backstopped by the technological revolution of the pill and abortion, and now IVF and all the various technologies. Now, of course, I think the sexual revolution is still quite predominant, or that the effects of the sexual revolution are quite predominant. But some of its outer, let's just say, the ways in which it's pushed every limit, even to the point at which it was becoming, sort of could say, politically incorrect or inadmissible to acknowledge or regard a fundamental biological difference between men and women. I think that has proven to be a kind of outer limit politically, at least for the moment, of the sexual revolution. We'll see if that remains the case. But that reflects back to the first of those areas that I was mentioning, the idea of borderlessness or limitlessness. And I think, in a way, you could say the meeting point of those, where those two, or where that belief in borderlessness meets in a way in both, you could say, in the outer domain or the political domain, economic domain, in the belief in borderlessness, and it meets in the kind of, we could say, biological domain, or the kind of internal, the corporeal domain, when we think of human sexuality. In all of these spheres, and these are just four that I can just rattle off the top of my head, I think we see the kind of, the limits of liberalism. The limits of its own logic have now led to a kind of rejection, a blowback that's often regarded or described as populist, but it may also be just simply where those beliefs in limitlessness touch reality, and where reality touch the everyday lives of ordinary people. And so when I say that we are post-liberal, I think we could just talk about those four domains all day long and say that in whatever way, shape, or form, the sort of the world in which we are entering looks like, it's not going to be, or it's very unlikely to be, some form of the extreme versions of those four areas, as it seemed to have been moving toward only several years ago.
So I want to try to make a distinction. Maybe it's a bit pedantic between, I guess, what I would call liberalism and maybe neoliberalism, and really sort of drawing the line right at the end of the Cold War, because I'm struck by the extent everything you're describing certainly characterized the post-Cold War era, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. It seems to me it didn't necessarily characterize, say, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Whether in the sort of global Cold War context, certainly in the cultural conflicts of the time and so forth. And the reason I guess that matters, first of all, is I think a lot of people would say, well, we're in the Americans of the mid 20th century, sort of fundamentally liberals in the small L sense. But also because it goes to the question of, to what extent is that still a viable model, right? Because if you're saying kind of, well, everything we would call liberalism, we are moving beyond, then we're really in kind of terra incognita. If we're saying, well, we really went too far in the 90s, it feels like there's something much more tangible to start from, or build from anyway, if we reach back to it. So how do you think about how you would characterize that prior era and how it fits into the broader
Yeah.
analysis.
So there's the question of contingency, or you're raising the questions of contingency versus a kind of inevitability, to put them on sort of extreme poles. And I tend to be a bit more in the inevitablist camp, although uh, I'm a soft inevitablist, if you will. In other words, I think that there was a strong tendency within the liberal ethos uh, that moved. You could say, when occasion arised, that in a liberal order, uh, various agents, various, you could say, the sort of the leaders within a liberal order, whenever there was a confrontation with any kind of a limitation on individual freedom, the strong tendency over time was to seek to tear down or to eliminate that obstacle, and to redefine any obstacle as a matter of arbitrariness. So what might have seemed somewhat natural 20 years earlier, or 50 years earlier, or 100 years earlier, now became increasingly regarded as a kind of arbitrary obstacle or limitation. Now, did it have to? In some alternate universe, did this always and everywhere have to happen? It's possible that it doesn't, and it didn't. There are all kinds of factors. We just mentioned the Cold War being one of them. I mean, the fact we were engaged in this sort of world-defining battle between two fundamentally opposite ideologies, I think exacerbated this tendency. So perhaps absent a Cold War, we might not have seen these sort of extreme developments within the liberal order of, in a sense, the extreme form in which it could take. But nevertheless, I would say, to the extent I'm a soft inevitablist, these tendencies are there. So one of the things we've seen in liberal orders from the very beginning is its a sense of affront when confronted with borders or barriers to movement, barriers to freedom, however expressed, freedom of movement, freedom of motion, freedom of belief. Now, that is initially defined, especially as protecting, you could say, protecting societies or ways of life that were not in themselves liberal. And that, I could say that's a very American, fundamentally American thing, right? The Puritans who first come over here, the various religious traditions that come over here from Europe seeking to escape persecution, are liberal in a kind of older sense, in which let us live our way of life and you live your way of life, and don't interfere in our particular religious beliefs, and we won't interfere in your particular religious beliefs. But within those societies, we already begin to see very early on a kind of, a claim that the oppressiveness within those communities necessitates the ability to be able to exit, to be able to free oneself of the limitations and the oppressions of those communities, which inevitably draws in the need for some agent to become that which guarantees the liberation of individuals from within those oppressive communities. And so the state goes from being an indifferent referee, a kind of neutral referee within the older form of liberalism, now increasingly to a kind of active agent of liberation, whether sort of in a more passive sense, allowing exit, creating avenues for exit, or in a more active sense, like forcing open what are seen as closed communities. So I think that there is certainly an element of contingency, but all this is to say, I'm not of the view that one can simply say, okay, this was a mistake in the 1990s and we can just go back to the way things were. And that's really was kind of the point of the argument of the lecture that you mentioned, the Newhouse lecture, was to point out the ways that even the seeming alternatives to liberalism today are deeply informed by a kind of liberal ethos that tends in a direction itself of a kind of post-liberalism.
So that then brings us to the question of what post-liberalism would look like. I guess by default, once you are beyond liberalism, you just have to look around. It is post-liberalism, but it certainly seems to me anyway that we are not at some new stable equilibrium
Yeah.
at the moment. And with due respect to the fine people of the abundance movement, I'm pretty sure that's not going to resolve matters. Um, what are the sorts of trade-offs you think are most important to grapple with, or that you see people grappling with, and realizing, okay, maybe we wish we could have A, B, and C, right? Maybe we wish why can't we just go back to the 1960
Mhm.
settlement? And you've sort of started to elaborate, well, no, here's the reasons that's not a stable equilibrium. What do you see as a couple of the key choices then that people are saying, okay, well, if we want to take borders seriously, let's say, if we want to have various kinds of constraint, here are some of the things you're actually going to have to give up that for a while most people across the political spectrum have kind of taken for granted as obviously true and right and good in America.
So let me, I may be somewhat stiff arming one key element of your question just for a moment. And let me, because I think the way you began your question was, what is post-liberalism, or what do you mean by post-liberalism? And as my opening comments describing those four areas indicate, I don't necessarily think we have a stable equilibrium of what post-liberalism is. What we have is a kind of a moment in which there's a widespread rejection, a kind of dissatisfaction, we could say an electoral reaction against, or a popular reaction against the sort of the extreme manifestation of liberalism's kind of logical trajectory, economically, socially, in terms of immigration, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of its, it's the way in which it insinuates itself into every aspect of life, including, of course, how we define human sexuality. So what we have at the moment is a kind of, an unstable disequilibrium of overturning what was thought to be the sole viable standing political order, certainly with the end of the Cold War, 1989, the end of history. And the claim that was made at that time, and it seemed very plausible to many of the people who were reading and discussing Fukuyama's thesis, is that we human beings have finally solved what seemed to be, the political theory version of, Fermat's last theorem. We've solved the question of what is the best regime, or at least the most appropriate regime for human beings to live in. And this had been the question that had been debated since at least Plato's Republic, if not earlier. What's the best political form? How should we determine who should rule? On what basis should decisions be made? Is it best to have a wise person rule? Is it best to have indifferent equal laws rule? How does one arrive at those? So all of these questions that have been in ferment since the very beginnings of examinations of political philosophy and a science of politics seem now to have been solved. And so we find ourselves in this very, on the one hand, very disconcerting moment from the standpoint of a political theorist and somebody interested in these questions. Also an exciting moment, because we don't often get to live through, living scientific experiments in a way. So I think we are in a sense just empirically in a post-liberal time. And so when I gave the Newhouse lecture and gave it the title, "We Are All Post-Liberals Now," I wasn't making the claim that, okay, we've replaced one seemingly stable equilibrium with another seemingly stable equilibrium. In fact, my claim is that there are a lot of aspirants to the claim that they are now, sort of running the show. And so I think that there's a variety of post-liberalisms at the moment, including everything from, post-liberalisms that we might regard as fairly reprehensible, whether it's the Chinese model or the Russian model, but also even within our own shores, there's still the claimant of a certain kind of illiberal liberalism of the left that's been dominant in elite institutions for the last 5 to 10 years. And there's a kind of growing claimant on the right, which is a kind of, as I described it in the Newhouse lecture, a kind of Nietzschean form of post-liberalism, which sometimes is called vitalism. And these are all various claimants to, it seems to me, to um, what should follow the time, that stable time that you have referred to several times.
And the right of center version, the so-called vitalism, I flesh it out a little bit what you see as the key tenets of that. I mean, I sort of simplify it sometimes as it's basically the strong should rule over the weak, and you pull out all the implications from there. Do you think that's a fair summary? What do you see as the key kind of, to the extent it is a coherent philosophy, the kind of key tenets that inform and drive it?
Yeah, so I can hardly claim to be, any kind of a world expert on the vitalist. I am reading quite a bit. It is, of course, I think, a very important actual, sort of current political movement. I mean, someone like Curtis Yarvin, I think, represents a certain strand of this. Bronze Age pervert is maybe one of the more prominent examples. There's figures like Nick Land, who's received some amount of notice. These may not be well known to your listeners, although I'm sure you've talked about some of these
Yeah.
folks from time to time. But they are quite influential, especially in the kind of online world, and a lot of the alt-right is kind of really tuned into developments, intellectual developments, whether firsthand or by second or third remove from various of these thinkers as they've been developed on various social media platforms. So I think at its most, I would say at its most recognizable level, and at a level, and this is what I tried to convey in the Newhouse lecture, at a level in which, within a liberal context, what's very recognizable is that a lot of the critiques of you called it center right. I would say it's a bit further from the center, but there is a way in which you can see a certain resemblance to the old center right, which is that it's highly critical of the kind of woke left, of the progressive left, especially in a couple of areas. And one of them you point to, it's not at its extreme version, it is the rule of the strong. But at its more, we might say its more acceptable level, it's the rule of the competent. It's the rule of those who are best able to do the kinds of works and functions that a society needs. And so it's one of its more, you could say, palatable and familiar forms that it takes is the argument for the restoration of the meritocracy. So many of the critiques of higher education today, law schools, admissions, all kinds of we could say the admissions gatekeepers to elite institutions, has been that they have moved away from a purely meritocratic assessment of the abilities, talents, and capabilities of various people. Now, this itself draws on you could say, a kind of more extreme version of what you were just touching on, which is that once one has identified the most competent, the most talented, there should not be really any limits to their ability to rule and to govern. In fact, one of the problems has been they've been too limited given various constraints of a liberal order. We could say, whether it's old forms of checks and balances or old religious peccadillos. And so here the Nietzschean form of this set of claims, I think, are quite important. And Nietzsche looms large in the ideas of certainly of Bronze Age pervert and figures like that, which is that that the strong should rule simply because ideally they would rule because they are the best, they are the strongest, they are the most entitled. They ought not to have any kind of soft-headed Christian or, let's say, old-fashioned view toward the concern or solicitude toward those who are less capable or less strong or powerful than they are. So there's a way in which this you could say the respectable form of this is undergirded by a kind of more I would say a more extreme and more far right version of a post-liberal vision of how the society should be ordered.
You mentioned it's especially popular. I've certainly seen it. It gains its most traction with younger conservatives. think it's safe to say probably disproportionately young men.
Yes.
And so I'm curious about your experience on campus in the university, what you see in people who come in either already identifying as conservatives, people who become conservative while they're there. I remember a generation ago, it was saying you were conservative on a college campus for the most part was synonymous with like libertarian, and you still kind of liked Ayn Rand. I've found certainly when I visit campuses now, the conservative troops kind of proudly announce they've defenestrated the one remaining libertarian member of the group. Um, what has been your experience? What do you see sort of broad strokes as the trends, and what do you think is at the root of it?
Yeah, no, it's certainly the case that this a broad set of ideas and broad set of thinkers have become extraordinarily appealing, especially to young men, as you point out, and especially at elite universities. So these are especially young men who have, in their own view, often believe that they've sort of navigated what is increasingly a very difficult, challenging route to success, given the fact that they are all the wrong demographics in terms of today's sort of hierarchy of victims who can claim, in a sense, the victim status. And yet who have, even in the process of achieving some degree of success, getting into an elite school, nevertheless still feel themselves to be, in an odd way, but not inaccurately, believe themselves to be as kind of oppressed group within that elite institution. And by oppressed group, I mean that they are regarded with a high degree of suspicion because they are typically white men at an elite school. They've been, you could say, much of their education has been directed at describing to them and elaborating to them the ways in which their gender, their race, their sexual orientation, you name it, if they're Christian or all of these various aspects of their existence, all of these are inherently tend toward a kind of viciousness, tend toward a kind of vice, tend to make them vicious human beings. And so I think the appeal of someone like a Bronze Age pervert was to say, not only are you living in this kind of oppressive atmosphere, what he describes as the longhouse, right? This kind of matriarchal system of oppression that's designed especially to suppress the talents and abilities of those who, in the view of many of the figures in this movement, are actually most likely to express forms and to be manifestations of forms of great strength and great power, and even certain forms of virtue, that not only have they had to have those tendencies suppressed, but they have been disallowed from developing the kinds of abilities and capabilities that in a kind of better political, social atmosphere they would be able to have developed. So there's a kind of deep sense of dissatisfaction at two levels. There's been this kind of suppression of that which they are, and a deep disapproval of developing what they could be. So at one level, it's perhaps the case that as wokeness, as the kind of extreme form of progressive illiberal liberalism, if we want to put it that way, as that has perhaps crested, as that has reached its high watermark, it's very possible that this kind of reaction against it may also reach its high watermark. At the same time, it's kind of infiltrated pretty deeply into, as we've been saying, it's infiltrated deeply into the beliefs of a younger set of especially young men, but not only young men, who are now entering the kind of, the time of their life when they're assuming, greater and greater positions of influence and power. They're beginning their move up the kind of career ladder. So I would expect to see this have some legs going forward for the next number of years to number of decades.
Have you seen a constructive version of it? If one wanted to take these impulses partly as the sort of backlash against the illiberal liberalism and as one strain of potential post-liberalism, but also stipulate that maybe as being pursued online and so forth, it is not an especially healthy or promising basis for the future of the society. Is there a modification of it, a different flavor of it? Where have you seen it foster constructive thinking? If you're thinking, whether it's your students or others, what's the positive version of a post-liberalism that you could see emerging from it?
Well, this particular strand, I actually think is really quite pernicious, and I'm probably among the more vocal critics of this form. That's not to say I don't at some level sympathize with why young men in particular, but not only, why they would have been attracted to this at the time when they were. I mean, we're talking about a time of, again, sort of smothering wokeness, a kind of disapproval of the very existence of these young men, the kind of disassembling of the institutions that once were the spaces where young men could develop their talents and abilities, and a sense of a kind of a justifiably good and positive form of masculinity, and Boy Scouts being one of them, but not the only one. I mean, strikingly, largely dismantled in the last decade or so. And then add to that the kind of the suppression and sense of oppression that COVID represented to many of these young people. It's comprehensible, and I can sympathize with why this was attractive. But when you spend a little bit of time reading this, I think its perniciousness becomes pretty clear. And I'll give the reasons. It's less for the reasons that are usually given, especially by the opposition, by the left, which the left tends to accuse it of being fascist or fascist adjacent, of being racist and sexist, all the various isms. They're in various formulations. There are passing occasions where that resemblance can be discerned, but I think its overwhelming emphasis is, interestingly, a kind of a form of libertarianism. It's not the libertarianism of yesteryear. It's not the kind of Friedman economistic libertarianism. So when the war cry goes up that we've defeated the last libertarian on campus, that's the kind of libertarian that doesn't carry weight in a sense anymore. But it is libertarian in a way, because what it basically says is that we want all of our various abilities and capabilities to be freed from the oppressions and the kind of the conformity of everyday life and mediocre society. Most human beings are content to live in the smothering normalness of mediocre everyday life. In this sense, it's very Nietzschean, right? It's drawing on a very Nietzschean strand. Most people are conformists. Most people, including young men, want to live in the longhouse. They want to fit in. And it's really the unique individual that yearns to break free from this kind of conforming, oppressive mediocrity and to have their genuine excellence sort of break free. And the way in which someone like Bronze Age Pervert describes this is that the worst thing in the world would become someone who becomes sort of socially useful to other human beings. So you shouldn't aspire merely to be economically successful, or you certainly shouldn't aspire to get married and have a family. That's like the ultimate form of, oppression and normality. The image that he constantly refers back to is that of the pirate. One should aspire to become the modern version of the pirate, not to feel that you're bound to any particular place, that you and some small band of brothers can sort of range free on an ocean of infinite possibilities without obligations to any other human beings, perhaps running raids occasionally, but living largely a life of freedom. And so when I call this a certain kind of post-liberalism, it's a very liberal post-liberalism. You can recognize a strand of liberalism, which is that this is about escape from the everyday normalness of life into some genuine, adventurous life outside of the stultifying norms of everydayness. It's not, it's not fascism. In fact, he actually counsels against going into politics. Politics is it's kind of crude and boring. And again, if that's your calling, fine, go do that. But the genuinely free person will seek to exist sort of outside of any political world. So it in a way, you ask if it has its constructive version. I don't know, maybe it's constructive if some of these people end up being novelists, and they offer some genuinely great art for the rest of us normies. But in terms of where I am, educating the normies, educating people to live lives in community, in a nation, in proximity to other human beings, and believing that they have some kind of mutual obligation to each other. I actually think it's rather pernicious because it does draw, I think it does draw off some of our more talented young people who might become great contributors to their communities.
Have you found particular arguments to be more or less persuasive, to the extent that maybe you're not taking a position in class, but over coffee or a beer, sort of actually engaging with students who might be carrying forward these ideas? Is there something that sort of catches them and makes them stop and think and realize maybe I want to be a pirate isn't the most mature or sophisticated or plausible path forward?
Well, I think we can begin, and where I do often begin with, and I must admit that at Notre Dame, maybe a little bit of an exception in terms of elite institutions. We don't necessarily I haven't encountered a lot of students drawn to this particular worldview. Not to say that there aren't some. They tend to be more at the Ivy League, East Coast Ivy League schools, and I think places like Stanford maybe especially, has some draw and attraction there. And because there is a certain family resemblance to some of the kind, the Elon Musk, Peter Thiel kind of libertarianism, that there's a family resemblance there. I think that there's some reason to that. But I think the place to begin is to agree that these folks who I've mentioned, in many cases, have offered very probing and persuasive critiques of the pathologies of the left that have developed over the last 20, 25, 30 years. Again, what has culminated in wokeness. And several times I've mentioned a kind of illiberal liberalism as the form or version of what the left is. The Newhouse lecture was to emphasize the ways in which these versions of the left, the progressive left, the woke left, and this form of the Nietzschean right, in interesting ways begin to resemble each other. It sounds strange to say, but they are at their hearts both liberationist movements. They're both movements that seek the radical liberation of human beings from whatever are perceived to be the stultifying norms of their contemporary life. And they culminate in a radical vision, especially of human freedom and individualism, that is to be especially achieved through our sexual liberation. I mean, it's just stunning how similar the human being is at the end of this process. So in a weird way, they both end up being kind of extreme forms of or culminating in an extreme form of a liberal human being, a form of liberation. Where we began, this liberated human being. So when I call them a kind of post-liberalism, they take a strand of liberalism, in this case, the liberation of the individual, and in their respective ways, achieve it through a kind of post or non-liberal form of life, whether it's the form of life of the left's form of illiberalism by suppressing especially conservative voices. Right? That's the way in which that form of liberalism is achieved, making sure no dissenters from the liberal view is allowed to speak out or even appear on campus. And on the left, this pirate who rejects any kind of form of having to live life within the norms of everyday life. So these two begin to really resemble each other, and yet the right version of this, I think, perceives the ways in which the left version of this has some serious negative forms and has been genuinely oppressive to human excellence. I think that the critiques of various of these figures that I've mentioned are quite perceptive. I think Curtis Yarvin, for example, he's not bad, but I think his critiques of the cathedral have been really quite probing and prescient. But where I would part company with any of these, both on the left and the right, are the respective solutions. And I think probably it's for my, given my, where I'm situated, I would end up speaking at greater length precisely with those young people that might be drawn to the critique of the left, but not yet sufficiently thoughtful about what are the various alternatives to not only the left, but to the kind of, the sort of vision of radical emancipation that seems to be at the heart of the right's version of this.
Right. Well, I can't let you go without saying something about what the more positive version would be, and I can infer from the way that you are critiquing both the sort of left version and the right version of and the emphasis on liberation, that the alternative, perhaps superior post-liberalism response to what liberalism got wrong, why liberalism failed, if you will, is instead something that is more skeptical of liberation and embraces in some way a greater emphasis on obligation or constraint. That's something that I'm myself fascinated by, where it always becomes a challenge is how that becomes realized in a politics that is, you can sort of hope for a religious revival, you can wish that Hollywood made a different kind of movie, but what in your mind does it actually look like to see those values elevated? Do you see a path forward there, or do you see any kind of initial steps for where it's most important to focus?
Yeah. No, I think this is obvious. This is where the Newhouse lecture was really a prolegomena to part of a project in which I'm hoping to precisely begin to at least sketch out some of what I would think of as the more positive form of post-liberalism, or the form of post-liberalism that I think is more positive in the sense it is socially, politically positive. It would offer to us a vision of human flourishing. And we're in an interesting place right now because there's a contestation on the right over what the kind of, what should be the post-progressive, post-woke world. Mm-hmm. What should that look like? I would say it's split into not entirely even thirds. So a somewhat larger third, maybe a fourth, no, a fifth, would be a version of how you began this podcast, which is to say, why can't we go back? Why can't we go back to the 60s or the 50s? So if we can just overturn the most pernicious aspects of the woke left, we'll see a flourishing of civil society. Maybe we'll see a kind of religious revival, and maybe we're even seeing it now. We're seeing kind of extraordinary numbers of young people interested in religion, large numbers entering the Catholic Church last Easter Vigil. So perhaps that is, we're just seeing a kind of new great awakening. We're on the verge of that. And once wokeness is done, once that ersatz religion has been overturned, a kind of healthy society will come in and fill its place. A different version is what we've been discussing, is the kind of the vitalist rights understanding, which is a kind of, I think maybe a kind of Elon Musk-esque tech bro, maybe Peter Thiel sort of vision of America's future, in which it's a kind of technological Wild West. And by technological Wild West, not only do we have, we're talking about AI and spaceships and every imaginable new technology creating entirely new frontiers, but the ability to pursue any way of life, any form of existence, whether it's going to the moon or creating islands off the coast, seasteading, the vision of a new Wild West, of a new frontier, seems to me that's a kind of active belief on the right as well. And arguably those are the two that are getting the most play right. Those are the two. Is you have the kind of old social conservatives who they firmly hope and believe that with the elimination of, or the diminution of the woke progressive behemoth, the kind of the nanny state, the activist state getting into all of our grills, we'll see a kind of an upsurge of a healthy civil society. And then the kind of tech bro right, which has a kind of opposite vision in a way, which is that we'll be liberated from the norms of civil society, and we'll see this flourishing of inventiveness and a kind of, potential new species emerging, right? Kind of entirely, not just a new frontier as land, but an entirely new frontier as the possibility of a new human species emerging. There's a third, and I suppose it's maybe I'm trying to put it on an equal footing with these because it's the position I represent. But I do think it is not an insubstantial position. And I think you see it articulated. Well, frankly, I think American Compass is part of this in its own way.
Yeah.
I think there are ways in which J.D. Vance straddles all of these in a way, but he does, aspects of him represent this, which is that the position is the following. There's been so much destruction of the forms of life from which we might think healthy forms of community and flourishing civil society continuously recreate and reproduce each other, so that that civil society isn't something that just kind of pops up once you remove the evils of the state. It is a kind of it requires a kind of long development of practices and customs and ways of life that then are handed down from one generation to the next. And of course, those alter and change and develop over time. They're not static. They are evolving like any tradition. And what's happened over the last, I don't know how many years, at least several decades, maybe 50, maybe it's been a long kind of decay that we can trace back for a much longer time, is we're at a kind of terminus in which what we see is a kind of wasteland of dead husks economically, socially, familially. And here's where I think, in a way, taking from the playbook of the left, we need to marry, in a way, the left's belief that the public order, the political order, the government, the state, our collective selves can play a role in helping to assist the recreation of certain forms of life. So where we see a lot of activity right now, of course, is thinking about how the public order can help the assistance or assist in the formation of family life. Now, we might think family life, that's the most natural thing imaginable. It's what human beings do. seek to reproduce. That's a kind of basic urge. We like to eat and we like to reproduce, or at least go through the motions of each. And in fact, what we are confronting is a civilization that's not doing that natural thing very well anymore for a whole variety and host of reasons that we could spend a lot of time talking about. And so I think we're at a point where the right has to begin considering how the public order can assist, not force, not impose, but create conditions in which those forms of flourishing and those kinds of institutions have a better than even odd of succeeding, of reformulating. And I think this is not out of keeping with a longstanding tradition of America in which the public order has always seen itself as having a place in supporting the existence of marriage and of family and of community and of economic help within communities in the form of manufacturing or industrial policy or public works and the like. So I think what we really have is a generation or more of people on the right who have just simply thought that this is not what the right is or does. The right doesn't think about the ways that the public order, the political order, can contribute to the flourishing of human life. It's largely been suspicious toward the political order or the public order. And I think this is I would say a third possibility, a third contention that's on the field right now. And this is the post-liberalism that I would like to see emerge and strengthened over the coming decades.
Yeah, it's a great description of how I try to think about things. I think what we're trying to do at American Compass. So we are proud to be in that third of the pie with you, and and appreciate all the work you're doing. Thank you so much for making the time today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Oren. Good to talk with you.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.